Do you believe that a single phone call can unravel an entire web of lies? He thought the darkness of a basement office and the hum of computers would hide his secrets forever. But from the desk 3 feet away, someone had been watching it all unfold. And she wasn't just anyone. I only needed 2 things: legally obtained evidence and the courage to follow the digital breadcrumbs. The rest I'd let the authorities and the internet do their work. My name is Jennifer Martinez, and at 29, I'd built my career on finding financial discrepancies before they became disasters. As a forensic accountant at Blackstone and Associates in Phoenix, Arizona, I spent my days following money trails, uncovering fraud, and ensuring every transaction could be traced back to its source. It's ironic how the biggest fraud of my life was happening right under my own roof, orchestrated by the man who shared my bed every night. The warning signs started appearing 6 months after I married David Richardson. He was 34, owned a successful consulting firm downtown called Richardson's Strategic Solutions, and had swept me off my feet with his charm and apparent financial stability. We'd met at a charity gala for the Phoenix Children's Hospital, where he'd written a check for $15,000 without hesitation. His generosity had impressed me then. Now I understand it was all part of the performance. We'd bought a beautiful house in Scottsdale, complete with a home office in the basement, where David claimed he did his real work after hours. The basement had been converted into what he called his command center: multiple monitors, high-end computers, filing cabinets with industrial locks, and a safe I'd never seen opened. He said it was where he managed his clients' portfolios and conducted sensitive business. I respected his privacy and never questioned the late-night phone calls or the constant clicking of keyboards echoing through the floor vents. My sister Rebecca had been battling ovarian cancer for 2 years. At 31, she'd exhausted her savings on treatments, experimental therapies, and mounting medical bills. Rebecca was a kindergarten teacher before her diagnosis, the kind of person who spent her own money on classroom supplies and stayed late to help struggling students. She'd always been the selfless one in our family, the one who put everyone else's needs before her own. Watching cancer steal her strength, her savings, and her future had been devastating for all of us. When her oncologist at the Mayo Clinic recommended a cutting-edge immunotherapy treatment at MD Anderson in Houston, the cost was staggering: $180,000 up front, with no insurance coverage. The treatment was experimental, not yet approved by insurance companies, but it represented Rebecca's best chance at long-term survival. The oncologist had been brutally honest. Without this treatment, she had maybe 6 months. With it, her 5-year survival rate jumped to 70%. That's when our family rallied in ways I'd never seen before. Mom and Dad, both retired teachers, living on modest pensions, took out a home equity loan against their house in Tempe. The house Dad had built with his own hands in 1987, where Rebecca and I had grown up, where every holiday was celebrated, where our children would hopefully play someday. They borrowed $85,000 against their only asset. Our brother Michael, a firefighter in Tucson, with 3 kids of his own, drained his entire 401k, $47,000 that was supposed to fund his retirement in 20 years. His wife Maria cried when he told her, not from anger, but from the impossible choice between her husband's future security and her sister-in-law's life. And I contributed $50,000 from my savings account, money I'd been accumulating to eventually start my own forensic accounting practice. Every dollar represented a dream deferred, but Rebecca's life was worth more than any professional ambition. But even with our combined sacrifices, we were still $80,000 short of the required amount. The treatment couldn't be delayed. Cancer doesn't wait for convenient timing or family financial planning. That's when David, my husband of 6 months, stepped up like a hero, straight out of a movie. "I'll cover it," he announced at Rebecca's bedside in the oncology ward. "Family takes care of family." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of Rebecca's monitors. She was between chemo cycles, weak but alert, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that hid her hair loss. Rebecca cried with relief, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. Mom hugged him like he was her own son, whispering "thank you" over and over. Even Dad, who'd been skeptical of David from the beginning, who'd questioned whether a 6-month marriage was long enough to truly know someone, shook his hand with genuine gratitude. "How can we ever repay you?" Rebecca whispered, her voice hoarse from the chemotherapy. "Don't worry about it," David said, squeezing her hand gently. "Just focus on getting better. Money can be replaced. You can't." The words were perfect, the delivery flawless. I fell even deeper in love with this man who would sacrifice his own financial security to save my sister's life. Within 48 hours, David had arranged the wire transfer, $80,000 sent directly to MD Anderson's financial office. The treatment was scheduled to begin the following Monday. Rebecca began the most aggressive therapy protocol available, a combination of immunotherapy and targeted radiation that pushed her body to its limits while attacking the cancer at a cellular level. And I fell even deeper in love with the man I'd married, the man who'd proven that my family was his family, that our burdens were his burdens, that love wasn't just words, but actions backed by sacrifice. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of watching Rebecca slowly respond to treatment, of seeing hope return to my parents' eyes, of feeling grateful every day for marrying a man of such character and generosity. The first red flag appeared on a Tuesday evening in November. I was working late on a client's books, a construction company with some irregularities in their subcontractor payments that I was trying to untangle. The work required absolute concentration, which is why I initially tried to ignore the sounds coming from David's basement office. But our house's heating system carried sound through the vents in strange ways, and David's voice drifted up clearly through the floor grates. At first, I assumed it was a normal business call. David often worked late, managing his clients' portfolios and investments. His consulting firm specialized in financial strategy for small businesses, and late-night calls weren't unusual. But something in his tone made me pause. There was a smugness there, a satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for a professional conversation. "The Houston payment cleared," he was saying. "Yeah, $80,000. She has no idea it came from her own account." I froze at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her own account? Rebecca didn't have $80,000. None of us did. That's why we'd all sacrificed so much. "The power of attorney forms were perfect," David continued, his voice carrying clearly through the vent. "Having her sister as the healthcare proxy made everything look legitimate. Jennifer signed off on the whole medical assistance fund without reading the fine print." Medical assistance fund? I'd never signed anything called that. I would have remembered. My forensic training made me compulsive about reading every document before signing. I crept to the top of the basement stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid David might hear it. The basement door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried up the stairwell clearly. "By the time the cancer treatment is over, we'll have cycled through most of their family savings. The beauty is they're also grateful. They're not asking questions about where the money's actually coming from." I backed away from the stairs, my mind racing. What power of attorney forms? What medical assistance fund? And most importantly, if David hadn't paid for Rebecca's treatment, who had? The implications were staggering. Had David somehow accessed our family's money without our knowledge? But how? The contributions had come from separate accounts. My parents' home equity loan, Michael's 401k, my own savings. How could David have touched money that wasn't his? That night, after David came upstairs and went through his normal bedtime routine, kissing me goodnight, telling me about his busy day at the office, asking about Rebecca's progress, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His breathing became steady beside me, the deep rhythm of someone sleeping peacefully without a care in the world. But I couldn't sleep. David's words kept echoing in my mind. She has no idea it came from her own account. The casual cruelty of it, the satisfaction in his voice when he described our gratitude. At 2 a.m., I slipped out of bed and went to my home office. I accessed our online banking, my forensic training kicking in automatically. Start with the transactions. Follow the money. Document everything. The $80,000 wire to MD Anderson had indeed come from our joint account, just as David had claimed. But when I traced it back, looking at the source of funds, I found something that made my blood run cold. 3 days before the wire, there had been a deposit of $85,000 from something called Martinez Family Medical Trust. Martinez Family Medical Trust? I'd never heard of such a thing. And Martinez was my maiden name. I spent the next 4 hours following the digital trail, using every forensic technique I'd learned in my professional career. What I discovered was a financial crime so elaborate and cruel that I had to check the numbers 3 times to believe what I was seeing. The Martinez Family Medical Trust had been established 6 weeks after Rebecca's cancer diagnosis, using forged documents that bore my electronic signature. The trust document named David as the sole administrator, with complete discretionary authority over all funds. But the funding sources were what made this truly diabolical. The trust had systematically collected money from our family's various sacrifices, My parents' $85,000 home equity loan had been deposited into the trust through a series of intermediate accounts. Michael's $47,000 401k withdrawal had been rerouted through what appeared to be a legitimate medical finance company, but was actually another entity controlled by David. My own $50,000 savings had been transferred into the trust through forged authorization forms. But the most shocking discovery was the Robertson Emergency Medical Fund, a $25,000 contribution that had supposedly come from Rebecca's own resources. Robertson was Rebecca's married name from her brief marriage to her college boyfriend Tom, a marriage that had ended in divorce 5 years ago. Rebecca had no assets under that name, no accounts, no holdings whatsoever. David had created an entirely fictional funding source and used it to make the numbers balance. David had collected every penny our family had sacrificed for Rebecca's treatment, funneled it through his fraudulent trust, then generously paid for her medical expenses using our own money while making himself appear to be the hero who'd saved her life. But it got worse. Much worse. I found additional transactions that had nothing to do with Rebecca's medical care. Money flowing from the trust into David's business accounts, labeled as administrative fees and trust management costs. Transfers to investment portfolios I'd never heard of, justified as growing the fund for future medical expenses. The trust that was supposed to be helping my dying sister was being systematically drained by my husband for his own purposes. There were payments to luxury car dealerships. David had recently upgraded to a BMW M5, claiming his business was doing exceptionally well. There were transfers to real estate investment accounts. David had mentioned looking at rental properties as a way to diversify our portfolio. There were even payments to high-end restaurants and hotels, David's business dinners and client meetings that I'd assumed were legitimate business expenses. My husband had stolen approximately $240,000 from our family under the guise of helping Rebecca, then used that money to fund his own lifestyle while basking in our gratitude for his generosity. I documented everything with the methodical precision my forensic training had taught me. Screenshots of every transaction, copies of bank statements, routing numbers, account details, dates, amounts, descriptions. I created a spreadsheet tracking every dollar, its source, its path through David's trust system, and its ultimate destination. My compliance training had taught me the value of creating an unbreakable paper trail, and this was the most important documentation I'd ever compiled. By 4 a.m., I had assembled a complete picture of David's fraud. The scope was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. He hadn't just stolen money. He'd weaponized our love for Rebecca, turned our desperation into his opportunity, and made us grateful for the privilege of being robbed. I sat in our kitchen as the sun rose, staring at the evidence spread across my laptop screen. 37 pages of financial records that told the story of how the man sleeping upstairs had exploited my sister's cancer diagnosis to systematically rob our entire family. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future, had seen Rebecca's terminal diagnosis as a business opportunity. The next morning, David left for work as usual, kissing me goodbye and asking about Rebecca's latest test results with what I now recognized as manufactured concern. His performance was flawless. The caring brother-in-law worried about his wife's sister, the generous man who'd sacrificed his own financial security to save a life. "She's responding well," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of guilt or concern. "The doctors think the treatment you paid for might have saved her life." He smiled, the expression that had once made my heart skip, now making my stomach turn. "I'm just glad I could help. Rebecca's such a fighter. She deserves every chance at beating this thing." The casual way he accepted credit for saving Rebecca's life, knowing he'd actually stolen the money that paid for her treatment, was chilling. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was psychological manipulation on a level I'd never encountered. After he left, I called in sick to work and drove to my attorney's office. Sarah Chen had handled my divorce from my first marriage and specialized in complex financial fraud cases. She'd seen her share of elaborate schemes, but when I spread David's financial records across her conference table, even she looked stunned. "Jennifer," she said after reviewing my documentation for 20 minutes, "this is federal wire fraud, potentially money laundering, and definitely theft. But more than that, he's committed these crimes against a cancer patient and her family during a medical crisis, which adds enhancement charges that could double his sentence. What do I do? How do I stop him?" First, we need to understand if this is ongoing. Is he still actively stealing money? I thought about David's recent behavior, his casual mentions of new investment opportunities, his suggestions that we should plan for Rebecca's long-term care needs. I think so. He's been talking about setting up additional funding for ongoing medical expenses. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. Document everything. Don't confront him yet. We need to understand the full scope before he can destroy evidence or move money offshore. Have you noticed any changes in his behavior lately? New purchases, travel, lifestyle changes? I thought about David's recent extravagances. The BMW, his mentions of looking at rental properties, his expensive new watches, the weekend trip to Las Vegas he'd claimed was for a client conference. Yes, he's been spending money, claiming his business is doing exceptionally well. Using stolen funds to finance his lifestyle while your family believes he's their savior. Classic financial predator behavior. Sarah pulled out a legal pad. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go home and act normal. Continue documenting everything. I'm going to contact a friend at the FBI's white-collar crime unit. This level of sophistication suggests David might have done this before. That evening, I started recording conversations with David. Arizona is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of without his knowledge. My phone became a constant companion, always ready to capture David's admissions or plans for future fraud. The opportunity came sooner than expected. David had been in an unusually good mood all week, and over dinner Friday night, he brought up Rebecca's medical situation. Honey, David said, cutting into his steak with the expensive knife set he'd recently purchased, I've been thinking about Rebecca's medical expenses. I kept my voice steady, maintaining the facade of the grateful wife. What about them? Well, the treatment is going well, but there might be ongoing costs, maintenance therapy, monitoring, that sort of thing. Cancer treatment isn't just a one-time expense. The family will figure it out like we did before. We'll make whatever sacrifices we need to make. David shook his head, his expression serious and caring. Actually, I've been working on a more sustainable solution. I've set up a comprehensive medical trust that can handle not just current expenses, but future needs as well. A trust? I pretended ignorance, my phone recording every word. How does that work? It's brilliant, really. Everyone contributes based on their ability to pay, and the trust manages the funds for maximum efficiency. Professional investment management, tax advantages, legal protections. Much better than everyone emptying their individual accounts in crisis mode. My blood ran cold as I realized he was describing an expansion of his existing fraud scheme. That sounds complicated. Not at all. I handle all the complex details. The family just needs to focus on supporting Rebecca emotionally while I ensure the financial resources are there. David's voice carried the smooth confidence of a practiced con man. I've already talked to your parents and Michael about contributing more to ensure long-term security. More? I tried to keep the panic out of my voice. Your parents are considering a reverse mortgage on their house. It would free up about $150,000 for Rebecca's long-term care, and they could continue living there for the rest of their lives. It's really a perfect solution. He was going after my parents' home, the house Dad had built with his own hands, where Rebecca and I had grown up, where our children should someday play. David wanted to steal the roof over my elderly parents' heads. David, they're 67 and 69 years old. That house is their retirement security. And Rebecca is their daughter, he said firmly, using their love for her as a weapon against them. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices for family. I know it's hard, but think about how you'd feel if Rebecca took a turn for the worse and we didn't have resources available for experimental treatments. I excused myself to the bathroom and immediately texted Sarah. He's targeting my parents' house now. Reverse mortgage. Can you stop this? Her response came immediately. Recording everything? We need him admitting to the existing fraud before we can prevent new crimes. Keep him talking. When I returned to the table, David was on his phone, speaking in low tones. I caught fragments of the conversation. The reverse mortgage application. Yes, they're very motivated. Family medical crisis. Should close within 2 weeks. He hung up and smiled at me. Sorry, business call. Where were we? You were explaining how the trust works. Right. The beautiful thing about this structure is that it removes the emotional burden from the family. Instead of everyone scrambling during each medical crisis, there's a professionally managed fund that can respond immediately to any need. David's eyes lit up as he described his scheme, and the investment returns actually grow the fund over time, so it becomes self-sustaining. What kind of returns are you getting? I asked, giving him rope to hang himself with. Exceptional results. The initial $240,000 has grown to nearly $320,000 in just 3 months. I have access to investment opportunities most people don't: private equity, hedge funds, cryptocurrency portfolios. I almost gasped. According to the bank records I'd seen that morning, the trust currently held $127,000. David had just lied about $190,000 while being recorded. He was either completely delusional about his investment performance, or he was preparing to explain away the missing money by claiming market losses. That night, I heard David on another phone call in his basement office. This time, I positioned myself deliberately at the top of the basement stairs with my phone recording. "The reverse mortgage will close next week," he was saying. "That's another $150K into the trust, which gives us enough liquidity to expand into the cryptocurrency portfolio we discussed." Cryptocurrency portfolio? This wasn't about medical expenses anymore. This was about David using our family crisis to fund his own investment schemes. "The sister's prognosis is actually improving," David continued, "which is inconvenient for our timeline. But cancer treatment can always take unexpected turns, if you know what I mean." My hand gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. Was he suggesting that Rebecca's recovery was a problem for his fraud scheme? No, David laughed, and I heard the clink of ice in a glass. He was drinking while planning to steal from my dying sister. Nothing dramatic, just that medical costs are unpredictable. Who knows what experimental treatments might become necessary? What additional procedures might be required? The implication was clear. David was planning to create fake medical expenses to justify draining the trust fund, regardless of Rebecca's actual medical needs. "The beauty of the cancer angle," David continued, "is that nobody questions medical expenses. They're just grateful someone else is handling the financial burden. Emotional manipulation at its finest." I'd heard enough. This man was planning to bankrupt my family using my sister's cancer as cover, and he was discussing it like a business strategy while drinking expensive whiskey in the basement office I'd helped him furnish. The next morning, after David left for work, I drove straight to the FBI field office in Phoenix. The building was an imposing glass and steel structure downtown, the kind of place that immediately made you feel the weight of federal authority. Agent Michael Torres listened to my recordings and reviewed my documentation with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen financial fraud before, but his expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the details. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, setting down the last bank statement, "what you've uncovered is sophisticated. The trust structure, the layered transactions, the exploitation of a medical crisis, the psychological manipulation. This suggests extensive experience with financial fraud. You think he's done this before? I think we need to investigate that possibility immediately. Predators who target families during medical crises don't usually start with schemes this elaborate." Agent Torres pulled out a thick file. "Are you willing to cooperate with a federal investigation?" "What would that involve?" "Continued documentation, possibly wearing a wire during conversations with your husband, allowing us to monitor the trust accounts in real time. It would require you to maintain normal behavior with your husband while we build a comprehensive case." I thought about Rebecca, fighting for her life with treatment she believed David had generously funded. I thought about my parents, considering mortgaging the home they'd spent 30 years paying off. I thought about Michael, who'd already sacrificed his retirement savings and was now facing pressure to contribute even more. "What do you need me to do?" Agent Torres smiled grimly. "Keep being a forensic accountant. Document everything, and help us catch him in the act." The next 3 weeks were the most difficult of my life. I maintained normal behavior with David while secretly working with federal agents to uncover the full scope of his fraud. Every conversation was potentially being recorded. Every financial transaction was being monitored. Every day brought new evidence of David's crimes. The FBI's investigation revealed stunning additional information that made David's fraud even more horrifying. Agent Torres called me to the field office on a Wednesday afternoon with updates that left me nauseous. "Jennifer, we've been investigating David's background, and we've uncovered a pattern. Your family isn't his first target." Agent Torres spread files across the conference table. In 2019, David defrauded the Patterson family in Denver. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. David befriended the family through a cancer support group, offered to help manage their fundraising efforts, and ultimately stole $180,000 that was intended for Emma's treatment. The photograph showed a beautiful little girl with bright eyes and a bald head, smiling despite the IV tubes connected to her small arm. "What happened to her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "She died. The family couldn't afford continued treatment after David's theft was discovered. By the time they realized what had happened, David had disappeared, and most of the money was gone." Agent Torres opened another file. In 2021, he targeted the Rodriguez family in San Diego. The husband, Carlos, had been diagnosed with ALS. David again posed as a helpful friend, offered to manage their medical trust fund, and stole $220,000 over 6 months. Carlos died 8 months later, partly because they couldn't afford the experimental treatments that might have extended his life. David had told them the trust fund was performing poorly due to market conditions. In reality, he'd spent the money on luxury cars and gambling in Las Vegas. I stared at the photographs of Emma Patterson and Carlos Rodriguez, two people who might still be alive if David hadn't stolen their hope along with their money. "He's a serial predator," Agent Torres explained. "He specifically targets families dealing with catastrophic medical expenses because they're vulnerable, desperate, and grateful for any help. He moves to new cities, establishes a new identity, finds new victims." "How did he choose our family?" "Your sister's cancer diagnosis was in the local newspaper when she did that fundraising run last year. David reads obituaries, cancer support group newsletters, hospital fundraising announcements. He's constantly hunting for new opportunities. The realization that David had been stalking our family, studying our vulnerability, planning his attack on our finances while pretending to fall in love with me was almost too much to process." "There's more," Agent Torres said gently. "David Richardson isn't his real name. His actual name is David Martin Kellerman. He's used at least 4 different identities over the past decade. The consulting firm, the business success, even his educational background. It's all fabricated. The man I'd married was a complete fiction." "Is our marriage even legal? That's for the lawyers to determine, but using a false identity to enter into a marriage contract is fraud in itself." Agent Torres pulled out another document. "We've been monitoring the trust accounts you identified, and David's been accelerating his theft. In the past week alone, he's moved $50,000 to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We need to act soon before he disappears with everything." The sting operation was scheduled for Friday evening. David had arranged a dinner meeting with my parents to finalize the reverse mortgage paperwork. FBI agents would be recording everything from a surveillance van outside the restaurant, and I would be wearing a wire to capture his admissions of fraud. The plan was to let David incriminate himself completely before making the arrest. Agent Torres wanted David to explicitly admit to the existing theft before he could claim the trust fund was legitimate or that he'd intended to repay the money. Once he admits to fraud on tape, with federal agents as witnesses, there's no defense strategy that can save him, Agent Torres explained. He'll face federal charges in multiple states for the previous victims, plus everything he's done to your family. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable rain pounding Phoenix, turning the desert city into a gray, sodden landscape that seemed appropriate for the end of my marriage and the destruction of the man I'd thought I loved. I wore a wire to dinner, a tiny recording device taped between my shoulder blades, invisible under my blouse, but capturing every word spoken at our table. My parents arrived precisely on time, Dad uncomfortable in his good suit, Mom clutching her purse nervously. "Frank, Margaret," David said warmly, embracing my parents like the son-in-law he'd never actually been. "I know this is a big decision, but think about Rebecca's future. This trust ensures she'll have resources for whatever comes next." Dad, who'd been quiet during the drive to the restaurant, finally spoke. "David, I appreciate everything you've done for Rebecca, but $150,000 is our entire housing equity. If something goes wrong with the real estate market, if we need long-term care ourselves." "Nothing will go wrong," David assured him, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had once charmed me. "The trust is completely secure, professionally managed, with multiple safeguards. And frankly, Frank, Rebecca's life is worth more than property values, don't you think?" The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced. I could see my parents wavering, their love for Rebecca being weaponized against their financial security. "How exactly does the trust work?" I asked, giving David the opportunity to hang himself with his own words. "Simple. All contributions go into a managed fund that I oversee personally. The money is invested conservatively to ensure growth while maintaining liquidity for any medical expenses that arise." David's explanation was word perfect, the kind of presentation he'd clearly given before. "And you manage it personally?" Mom asked. I have the financial expertise and the professional licenses required. It makes sense for me to handle the investment decisions rather than leaving medical funds sitting in low-yield savings accounts. What kind of returns are you getting? Dad asked, his teacher's instincts making him ask the practical questions. David smiled confidently. Actually, the initial funds have performed exceptionally well. The $240,000 contributed so far has grown to nearly $320,000. Conservative investments, but excellent returns. I almost gasped audibly. According to the FBI's monitoring of the trust accounts, the current balance was approximately $89,000. David had just lied about $230,000 while being recorded by federal agents. He was either completely delusional about the financial situation, or he was preparing to claim that market crashes had destroyed the investments. That's remarkable growth in just 3 months, I said carefully, trying to draw out more admissions. I have access to investment opportunities most people don't, David said with characteristic arrogance. Private equity firms, hedge funds, cryptocurrency portfolios. When you're managing significant capital, doors open that aren't available to individual investors. Could we see the account statements? Mom asked innocently. Not that we don't trust you, but Frank likes to understand where our money is going. For the first time all evening, David hesitated. His smooth confidence flickered for just a moment before he recovered. The statements are complex, lots of technical financial language, multiple account numbers, derivative positions. I can prepare a simplified summary that shows the overall performance without all the confusing details. Actually, I said, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid the wire would pick it up. As a forensic accountant, I'd love to see the technical details. I could help explain them to Mom and Dad, translate the financial jargon. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The mask of the caring son-in-law slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. Jennifer, I don't think that's necessary. Trust administration is quite different from your usual audit work. Different regulations, different reporting standards. But surely there's no harm in transparency, Dad said reasonably. If Jennifer can help us understand the investments, make sure we're making the right decision. Fine, David snapped, then immediately controlled his tone. Of course, family should understand family finances. I'll get you the statements next week. But I could tell from his expression that he had no intention of providing any documentation that would reveal the true scope of his theft. Agent Torres would later tell me that David's reluctance to provide documentation, combined with his lies about account balances captured on federal recording equipment, provided sufficient evidence to proceed with the arrest. The wire recording had captured multiple felonies: fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit additional theft. The arrest came the following Tuesday morning. I was at work, trying to maintain normalcy while knowing that federal agents were closing in on my husband when Agent Torres called. "We have him," he said simply. David Richardson, or should I say David Kellerman, was arrested 20 minutes ago at his office on federal charges of wire fraud, money laundering, theft, and conspiracy. The district attorney is also considering charges related to exploitation of vulnerable adults. I sat in my office, feeling a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief that the fraud was stopping, that my family wouldn't lose any more money to David's schemes. Devastation that my marriage had been built on lies and theft from my own family, that the man I'd shared a bed with was a predator who'd stalked us during our most vulnerable time. What happens now? The trust accounts are frozen pending investigation. We'll work to recover as much money as possible for your family and David's previous victims. His business assets, personal property, and the house are also being seized. And Rebecca's treatment. The medical bills were legitimately paid, regardless of the source of funds. Her treatment won't be affected. In fact, MD Anderson has been very cooperative. When they learned that your sister's treatment was funded by money stolen from her own family, they offered to provide any additional care she needs at cost. That evening, I drove to the hospital, where Rebecca was having her latest round of tests. The treatments had been working better than anyone had dared hope. Her tumor markers were down 70%, and her oncologist was cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. I found her in the oncology ward, looking tired but hopeful, wearing the bright yellow scarf Mom had knitted for her. "The doctors say the markers are down again?" she said excitedly when she saw me. "Dr. Peterson thinks I might be a candidate for the reduced treatment protocol if these trends continue. The treatment David paid for is working, Jen. I might actually beat this thing." I sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Rebecca's fingers were thin from the chemotherapy, but her grip was strong. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something about David's payment." I explained everything. The fraudulent trust, the theft of our family's contributions, the fact that our family had unknowingly paid for her own treatment while believing David was our savior. Rebecca listened in stunned silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. "So David didn't actually pay anything?" she asked finally. "No. He stole from all of us and made it look like generosity. The money Mom and Dad borrowed against their house, Michael's retirement fund, my savings. He took all of it and then pretended to contribute his own money." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, staring at the IV tube connected to her arm. Then she started laughing, a bitter sound that seemed inappropriate until I understood what she was thinking. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I felt so guilty. Here I was, dying, and this wonderful man was bankrupting himself to save me. I spent weeks worrying about how the family could ever repay him, how I could live with the debt if I survived." "Rebecca?" "No, it's okay. Actually, it's better this way. I'd rather owe money to family than to a stranger who might call in the debt someday. At least our family loves me. At least when Dad and Michael sacrificed their savings, they did it out of love, not as an investment they expected returns on." She squeezed my hand. "And now I don't have to feel guilty about David bankrupting himself for me, because he never did. The only money that paid for my treatment came from people who love me." The next day, the story broke in the Phoenix New Times. Local businessman arrested for defrauding cancer patient's family. David's arrest photo showed him in handcuffs, his carefully maintained professional appearance disheveled and defeated. The article detailed the charges and mentioned that David was suspected in similar crimes in other states. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, David's clients panicking about their investments, even some of David's previous victims reaching out after seeing the news. David's defense attorney called me personally that afternoon. "Mrs. Richardson, my client is concerned about the misunderstandings that have arisen. What would it take for this situation to be resolved amicably?" Misunderstandings? I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. David never intended for your family to suffer. He was trying to help, using sophisticated financial instruments that may have been misinterpreted. He stole $240,000 from my family while my sister was dying of cancer. That's a very harsh characterization. David was managing a medical trust fund, making investment decisions intended to grow the available resources into his personal bank accounts. There was a pause. What would it take for this to go away? David is prepared to make full restitution and provide a generous settlement for any inconvenience. Full withdrawal from any access to my family's finances, return of all transferred assets plus interest, and David stays away from all of us permanently. That's not negotiation. That's extortion. That's justice. Check your email. The FBI has copies of everything. She hung up, but called back an hour later with a different tone. "Mrs. Richardson, I've reviewed the federal evidence package. Perhaps we should discuss a plea agreement." The trial took 8 months. During that time, the FBI's investigation uncovered additional victims and revealed the true scope of David's criminal career. He hadn't just defrauded 3 families. The investigation eventually identified 11 separate fraud schemes over the past decade, totaling more than $1.8 million in theft. David had been systematically targeting families dealing with medical crises, moving from city to city, creating new identities, finding new victims. He'd stolen from families dealing with childhood leukemia, ALS, Alzheimer's, brain tumors, and multiple other catastrophic diagnoses. He'd weaponized hope and love, turning families' desperation into his profit margin. The trial revealed details that made David's crimes even more horrifying. The prosecution presented evidence that David had actually researched medical conditions, studied treatment protocols, and learned to speak knowledgeably about cancer therapy so he could better manipulate his victims. He'd attended support group meetings, read medical journals, even taken online courses in oncology nursing, all to perfect his ability to exploit families during their darkest moments. David's defense attorney tried multiple strategies. First, she argued that he'd intended to repay everything, that it was borrowing rather than theft. The prosecution destroyed this argument by showing that David had spent the money on luxury items, gambling, and high-risk investments rather than legitimate business expenses or conservative investments that could be liquidated for repayment. Then, she tried to claim that David suffered from a gambling addiction that impaired his judgment. The prosecution countered with evidence of David's meticulous planning, his creation of false identities, his careful research of victims, and his systematic approach to financial manipulation. This wasn't impaired judgment. It was calculated predation. Finally, she attempted to argue that the victims had given consent for David to manage their medical funds. The prosecution presented the recordings I'd made, showing David lying about account balances and admitting that his victims had no idea where their money was actually going. The turning point came when Agent Torres testified about the recorded dinner conversation, where David lied about trust fund performance while trying to convince my parents to mortgage their home. The jury listened in silence as David's voice played through the courtroom speakers, describing his fraud as emotional manipulation at its finest. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said in closing arguments, "this defendant didn't just steal money. He weaponized cancer. He took families at their most vulnerable moments, when they would sacrifice anything to save their loved ones, and he turned their love into his profit. He didn't just rob them of money. He robbed them of hope, of trust, of faith in human kindness." The prosecutor gestured to the evidence table, covered with photographs of David's victims. Emma Patterson was 8 years old when David stole her treatment fund. She died because her family couldn't afford continued therapy. Carlos Rodriguez was a father of 3 when David took his ALS treatment money. He died without the experimental therapies that might have extended his life. These aren't financial crimes. They're crimes against humanity itself. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was packed with victims and their families. Emma Patterson's mother read a victim impact statement that left half the courtroom in tears. Carlos Rodriguez's widow spoke about watching her husband die while believing his treatment fund had been lost to market volatility, never knowing it had actually been stolen to fund David's lifestyle. Rebecca, despite being in the middle of her own cancer treatment, insisted on giving a statement. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear despite her obvious frailness, "David Kellerman tried to murder me, not with a gun or poison, but with paperwork and lies. He tried to murder me by stealing the money that was keeping me alive, while making my family grateful for the privilege of being robbed." She looked directly at David, who hadn't met anyone's eyes during the entire hearing. But he failed. "I'm still here, my family is still here, and now everyone knows exactly what kind of monster you are." Judge Harrison, a federal judge known for his tough sentences in white-collar crime cases, wasn't moved by the defense's final plea for leniency. "Mr. Kellerman, you have committed some of the most despicable crimes I've encountered in 20 years on the federal bench. You didn't just steal money. You stole hope from dying patients and their families. You turned love into a weapon, desperation into opportunity, and trust into profit." The judge consulted his notes. "You have shown no remorse, offered no genuine apology, and demonstrated no understanding of the human cost of your crimes. The court has reviewed extensive evidence of systematic predation spanning more than a decade. The sentence was severe: 28 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15 years, full restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties, and a lifetime ban from any position involving financial management or access to vulnerable populations." The gavel came down with decisive finality, ending David's criminal career and ensuring he would spend the majority of his remaining productive years in federal custody. As we left the courthouse, I stopped on the steps where David had once posed for photos when his fake consulting firm had won a business award. Mom and Dad flanked Rebecca, who was walking with a cane but growing stronger every day. Michael and his family had driven in from Tucson for the sentencing. "It's over," Rebecca said. More statement than question. "It's over," I confirmed. "No," said a voice behind us. We turned to see Mrs. Patterson, Emma's mother, approaching with several other families I recognized from the trial. "It's not over. It's just beginning." She gestured to the group of families. "We're starting a foundation, the Emma Patterson Medical Trust, a legitimate organization that will provide real financial assistance to families dealing with medical crises, the kind of help David pretended to offer." "We want to be what we thought he was," added Mrs. Rodriguez. "People who genuinely help families when they're desperate and vulnerable." Rebecca's eyes lit up despite her exhaustion. "I want to help. When I'm stronger, when this treatment is finished, I want to be part of making sure no other family goes through what we did." 6 months later, Rebecca's cancer was officially in remission. She'd responded better to treatment than anyone had dared hope. Her 5-year survival prognosis had improved to 85%, and she was planning to return to teaching in the fall. More importantly, she'd found a new purpose. The Emma Patterson Medical Trust had become her passion project. The foundation provides legitimate financial assistance to families dealing with catastrophic medical expenses, but with extensive oversight and transparency requirements designed to prevent the kind of fraud David had perpetrated. I know what it feels like to be desperate enough to accept help from anyone, Rebecca told the foundation's first board meeting. I also know what it feels like to discover that the person helping you was actually hurting you. We're going to make sure families get real help, not predation disguised as charity. The foundation's first project funded medical treatments for 3 families who'd been defrauded by medical predators in other states but couldn't recover their stolen funds. They also created educational materials to help families recognize and avoid medical financial fraud. As for me, my marriage to David was annulled rather than divorced, since his use of a false identity made the marriage contract invalid from the beginning. I kept our house after the court battle. David's lawyers tried to claim it as a marital asset, but since David Kellerman had never legally existed and David Richardson was a fabricated identity, he had no legal claim to anything acquired under that name. I changed careers, leaving traditional forensic accounting to specialize in medical fraud cases. I work with the FBI, state attorney general offices, and private law firms to investigate and prosecute people who target families during medical crises. My experience with David made me uniquely qualified to recognize the warning signs and help other families protect themselves. The irony isn't lost on me. My professional skills, which should have protected me from financial fraud, were useless against someone who exploited my emotions rather than my intellect. David didn't fool me with complex schemes or sophisticated financial instruments. He fooled me with fake love and manufactured compassion. But that same professional training that failed to protect me ultimately provided the tools to destroy him. Every transaction he thought was hidden, every lie he thought was buried, every trail he thought was cold, I followed them all until they led to a federal prison cell. The basement office where David conducted his schemes is now Rebecca's art studio. She painted over the dark walls with bright colors and hung her pottery on shelves where David once kept his fraudulent documents. Light streams through windows he'd kept covered with heavy curtains to maintain the illusion of secrecy. "You know what's beautiful about art?" Rebecca said recently as she worked on a sculpture during her recovery. "It creates something new from raw materials. It transforms chaos into meaning." She gestured around the transformed space. David used this room to destroy things, to destroy trust, to destroy security, to destroy hope. Now I use it to create them. I think about that metaphor often. David took our family's resources and turned them into weapons against us, but we took his weapons and turned them back into resources. Evidence that brought justice, documentation that protected other families, truth that ultimately made us stronger than we were before. The paper trail that destroyed my marriage also destroyed David's freedom, ended his criminal career, and prevented him from victimizing countless other families. In the end, his own meticulous record-keeping became the evidence that convicted him. His arrogance in maintaining detailed financial records for tax purposes created the very documentation that sent him to federal prison. Some people ask if I regret investigating David instead of confronting him directly, if I wish I'd tried to save our marriage by working with him to make restitution quietly. The answer is simple. Confrontation might have saved my marriage, but investigation saved other families' lives. Emma Patterson's little sister will never have to worry about someone stealing her medical fund. Carlos Rodriguez's children will grow up knowing their father's killer was brought to justice. That's a trade I'll make every time. Rebecca recently got news that her 5-year survival odds have increased to 92%. She's not just beating cancer, she's thriving, despite everything David put our family through. She's planning to use her inheritance from our grandmother to expand the Emma Patterson Medical Trust, creating a national network that can identify and prevent medical financial fraud before families are devastated. I want to be what I thought David was, she explained during the foundation's annual meeting. Someone who genuinely helps families when they're desperate and vulnerable. But I want to do it with transparency, accountability, and real oversight. The foundation has grown beyond anything we imagined. They've assisted over 200 families, recovered more than $3 million in stolen medical funds, and helped law enforcement prosecute 17 medical predators across 12 states. More importantly, their educational programs have taught thousands of families to recognize and avoid medical financial fraud. David is currently serving his sentence at a federal facility in Colorado. According to the Bureau of Prisons website, his earliest possible release date is March 15th, 2039. He'll be 52 years old, with no assets, no business, no identity he can legally use, and a federal conviction that will follow him forever. He sends letters occasionally, always to Rebecca rather than me. They're desperate attempts at manipulation disguised as apologies. Classic predator behavior, designed to maintain some form of psychological control over his victims, even from prison. Notice how he never actually admits specific wrongdoing, Rebecca points out when she reads excerpts to the Foundation's support groups. It's always mistakes were made, or if I hurt anyone. Classic non-apology apology designed to make us feel guilty for maintaining boundaries. She saves the letters in a file folder labeled Evidence of Continued Manipulation, rather than destroying them. Someday, when David comes up for parole, the board will need to see that he's still trying to victimize us 15 years later. The house in Scottsdale sold last year. Rebecca and I bought a smaller place in Tempe, close to Arizona State University, where she's enrolled in a social work program specializing in medical family advocacy. She wants to help people navigate crisis situations without being exploited, using her experience as both a cancer survivor and a fraud victim to protect other vulnerable families. David took advantage of my vulnerability when I was dying, she says. Now I want to use that experience to shield other people's vulnerability when they're fighting for their lives. The basement office in our new house is nothing like David's command center. It's filled with sunlight and serves as our shared workspace, where Rebecca studies social work while I review fraud cases for law enforcement agencies. Sometimes we work in comfortable silence, two sisters rebuilding their lives on a foundation of truth instead of lies. We keep David's recorded confessions in a safe deposit box, along with all the evidence from his case and copies of his prison letters. Not because we need them anymore, but because the statute of limitations doesn't apply to federal crimes. And David's victims deserve to have evidence available when his parole hearings begin in 2037. Every few months, I receive calls from families dealing with medical financial fraud in other states. The FBI refers cases to me when they suspect predators are targeting cancer patients, ALS families, or other vulnerable populations. My experience with David has made me something of a specialist in this particular type of evil. Last month, I helped expose a scheme in Miami where a man was posing as a medical research coordinator to steal funds from families with children in experimental cancer trials. The case felt familiar, the same manipulation tactics, the same exploitation of hope and desperation, the same weaponization of love. But this time, we caught him before any children died. This time, the paper trail led to an arrest within weeks instead of years. This time, justice came quickly enough to save lives instead of just avenging them. The Miami predator is now facing federal charges that could result in a life sentence. His victims will recover most of their stolen funds. Their children will continue receiving treatment without interruption. And other families will be warned about his tactics before they can be victimized. This is what justice looks like when it works properly. Swift, comprehensive, and protective, rather than just punitive. Mom and Dad recovered about 80% of their stolen money after David's assets were liquidated. They decided not to rebuild their retirement savings, but instead to live modestly and donate the remainder to the Emma Patterson Medical Trust. We're too old to worry about leaving an inheritance, Dad said. But we're not too old to prevent other families from suffering what we went through. Michael rebuilt his 401k over several years, helped by the restitution payments and his firefighter's pension. His children now receive annual presentations at school about financial fraud prevention, using age-appropriate versions of Uncle David's crimes to teach them about predators who disguise themselves as helpers. I want them to understand that bad people don't always look scary, Michael explains. Sometimes they look like family members who offer to help during emergencies. The Emma Patterson Medical Trust has created a scholarship program for children of families who've been victimized by medical financial fraud. Emma's little sister Julia received the first scholarship when she started college this year, planning to study criminal justice with a focus on white-collar crime prosecution. I want to put people like David in prison before they can hurt families like mine, Julia told me during the scholarship ceremony. Emma didn't live to see justice, but I'm going to spend my career making sure other kids don't die because someone stole their treatment money. These are the moments that make everything worthwhile. When victims become advocates, when tragedy transforms into purpose, when evil accidentally creates more good than it destroys. David's final letter arrived last month. Instead of his usual manipulation attempts, it was different, desperate, rambling, and revealing. He'd apparently learned about Rebecca's recovery, about our foundation work, about the families we'd helped save from predators like him. "You don't understand what you've done to me," he wrote. "I'm marked in here. Everyone knows I stole from cancer patients. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't trust anyone. You've destroyed my life." Rebecca read the letter aloud to our support group, then looked around the room at the families we'd helped protect from medical financial fraud. "David says we destroyed his life," she said. "But David destroyed his own life when he chose to steal from dying patients. We just documented it properly." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the evidence file. And if documenting the truth destroys someone's life, that tells you everything you need to know about how they were living. The group applauded, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "David wants us to feel guilty for his consequences. But guilt belongs to the person who commits crimes, not to the people who expose them. We didn't send David to prison. David sent David to prison. We just made sure he arrived there." Last week, I received a call from Agent Tor of Agent Taurus with an update that felt like the final chapter in David's story. "Jennifer, you should know that David attempted to recruit other inmates for a new fraud scheme targeting veterans' medical benefits. He was caught by prison surveillance and has been moved to solitary confinement. His parole eligibility has been extended by 10 years. David was still trying to steal from vulnerable people, even from federal prison. Even after losing everything, facing decades in custody, and experiencing the consequences of his crimes, he remained fundamentally unchanged, a predator looking for new ways to exploit human suffering for profit. He'll never stop, I realized. No, Agent Taurus agreed. Men like David don't reform. They just look for new opportunities. But now he'll spend the rest of his productive life in maximum security, lot where the only people he can hurt are other criminals. David's earliest possible release date is now 2049. He'll be 62 years old, institutionalized, unemployable, and under federal supervision for the remainder of his life. His criminal career is truly over. But our work continues. The Emma Patterson Medical Trust is expanding internationally, partnering with organizations in Canada and the UK to identify medical financial predators who cross borders to exploit families during health crises. Rebecca has been invited to speak at medical conferences about recognizing and preventing fraud targeting cancer patients. I've been consulting with the Department of Justice on legislation that would create federal penalties specifically for medical financial fraud, with enhanced sentences for crimes targeting cancer patients, children with life-threatening illnesses, and families dealing with terminal diagnoses. David taught us that love can be weaponized, I told the Senate subcommittee considering the legislation. But he also taught us that documentation and persistence can protect other families from experiencing what we went through. The proposed law, nicknamed Emma's Law, after David's youngest victim, would create mandatory reporting requirements for medical financial institutions, establish federal oversight of medical assistance funds, and provide enhanced protection for families during medical crises. If passed, it would be Emma Patterson's most important legacy, a federal law preventing other 8-year-olds from dying because someone stole their treatment money. Rebecca graduated from her social work program last spring with highest honors. Her thesis, Predatory Behavior in Medical Financial Assistance, Recognition, Prevention, and Recovery, has become required reading at several universities training medical social workers. She's now employed by the Arizona Attorney General's office, specializing in crimes against vulnerable adults. Her first case involved a nursing home administrator who was stealing from Alzheimer's patients' families by creating fake medical expenses. The pattern was familiar, but Rebecca's experience made her uniquely qualified to recognize and document the fraud quickly. David taught me to recognize predators, she told me after securing a conviction in that case. Now I use that education to catch them before they can finish destroying families. The nursing home administrator received 12 years in federal prison. The families recovered their stolen funds. And other facilities across Arizona received training on preventing similar fraud schemes. Every victory feels like justice for Emma Patterson, for Carlos Rodriguez, for all the victims who didn't survive to see their predators caught. The paper trail that began with my suspicious bank records has now expanded into a national network of professionals dedicated to preventing medical financial fraud. Forensic accountants, social workers, FBI agents, prosecutors, and medical staff all working together to protect families when they're most vulnerable. We've created something David never intended, a system that makes his type of predation much more difficult and much more likely to be caught quickly. His crimes taught us how to prevent other crimes. His victims became advocates who protect future victims. This is how evil accidentally creates good. When people refuse to let tragedy be meaningless, when they transform their suffering into protection for others, when they build systems of justice that outlive their original purpose. David thought he was smart enough to steal from desperate families without consequences. He thought love and desperation made people stupid and easy to exploit. He thought documentation was bureaucratic nonsense that couldn't touch someone with his connections and charm. He learned that documentation doesn't care about charm. Evidence doesn't respect connections. And truth always wins in the end, even when it takes time to surface. The basement office where this all began is now filled with Rebecca's artwork and my case files. Light streams through windows that were once covered. Hope lives where secrets once festered. And two sisters work side by side, protecting other families from predators who mistake desperation for opportunity. David Martin Kellerman destroyed many things during his criminal career, but he failed to destroy the thing that mattered most: our family's love for each other and our commitment to protecting other families from experiencing what we endured. That failure cost him everything, and it gave us everything that truly matters: purpose, justice, and the knowledge that evil can be defeated by ordinary people with extraordinary determination to document the truth. The paper trail always wins in the end. Always. Final update, posted 3 years later. Rebecca has been cancer-free for 4 years and just got married to a wonderful man she met in her graduate program. Someone who actually is the kind of person David pretended to be. The Emma Patterson Medical Trust has helped over 1,000 families and prevented an estimated $50 million in medical financial fraud. David was denied parole at his first hearing in 2047 and remains in federal custody. Emma's law passed Congress unanimously and has been credited with preventing dozens of medical fraud schemes across the country. Sometimes justice takes time, but it's worth the wait. To anyone dealing with medical financial fraud, document everything. Trust your instincts. Call the FBI. And remember, legitimate help doesn't require you to sign documents you don't understand or give someone else control over your financial accounts. Real helpers provide transparency, not secrecy. Thanks for reading this long journey to justice. Sometimes the best revenge really is just the truth, thoroughly documented and patiently pursued.